Indigenous women and the construction of identities of Muslim women, particularly in the 9/11 context. And I'm going to conclude by examining some of the implications of the theory of accountability for the study of identity and difference. So, to begin, and I thank Dr. Smith for preempting my critique of liberal multiculturalism here. But to begin by why focus on the liberal multicultural version of identity and difference? Well, it's important to note that there have been at least 3 types of liberal responses to questions of identity and difference within the field of contemporary political theory. Firstly, we see a neutral liberal approach in which liberalism is viewed as a transcendent value over cultural pluralism. And here we can think about the work of such thinkers as Brian Barry or Chandra and Kukendas. A second school of thought is that of radical liberalism, in which it's argued that the colonial underpinnings of liberalism can and should be tempered so as to maximize the benefits of liberal thinking. So this is particularly reflected in the work of Duncan Iverson, Sheila Ben-Habib, and Bikku Parekh. But the school of thought that is normatively and theoretically most dominant is that of the liberal multicultural approach. And this is very much through the work of such thinkers as Will Kimlicka and Charles Taylor. These thinkers have not only determined debates within the Canadian context, but they've also permeated other geopolitical contexts, such as South Africa, India, and Eastern Europe. Kimlicka and Taylor are important scholars in the field of contemporary political theory, I think, because they've shifted the terrain of identity and difference politics so as to mainstream issues related to culture and diversity. Now, there are some notable differences between these two thinkers, and I'm happy to speak to those later on, but it's the similarities between these two thinkers that I want to focus on today. In particular, these two scholars focus on culture-based differences and why these should be respected and accommodated by the state, both because culture is understood as being intrinsically valuable, but also because it's understood as being instrumentally valuable. Both are also anxious about the concrete concerns of social unity in context of diversity. Both, as political theorists, are concerned about the origin of political authority, particularly the political authority of the state. And both, as liberals, are seeking to theorize the liberal democratic state in relation to the rights of individuals and communities. Now, whilst I think these are important contributions, ultimately I argue that liberal multiculturalism obscures and erases key aspects of the study of identity and difference. In particular, this approach neglects and masks the violence by which the identities of racialized women are constructed. This is done in 2 particular ways. Firstly, on a conceptual level, liberal multiculturalism conceives of identity in narrow terms. In particular, there's an overemphasis on culture as the main identity signifier, in which culture is really a synonym for particular kinds of ethnic, national, and linguistic groups. Now, this itself I don't think is a problem, but it's the essentializing tendencies within this conception of culture that does reflect a limit in the study of identity and difference. So, for example, both thinkers talk about Quebecois culture without any reference to the differences that exist between white and non-white French speakers. Moreover, the primacy assigned to culture masks the differences within groups, especially those differences constructed in context of gendering, heteronormativity, homophobia, capitalism, and disability. Furthermore, in their conception of culture, Kimlicka and Taylor avoid any reference to racialization, although Kimlicka does make a very explicit point of distinguishing culture from what he calls racialism. Thus, the problem of diversity emerges in liberal multicultural scholarship because of the demands made by cultural others, and not because of racialized power differences more generally. So they talk about cultural compatibility or cultural appropriateness without really dealing with the ways in which there are racial designators that signify different power arrangements. This version of identity and difference ultimately denies the very legacy of racism and racialization, which the discourse of liberal multiculturalism is itself premised. This not only serves to reproduce identity and difference as a problem of and for those marked as others, but it simultaneously removes the role of dominance in organizing socio-political relations. So the first critique is that through the primacy assigned to culture and this depoliticized conception of culture, liberal multiculturalists erase an understanding of the processes that signify the identities of Indigenous women and women of color. The second major explanation for the erasure of women of colour and indigenous women in liberal multicultural versions of identity and difference lie in the primary focus on the state, especially in terms of how the state should respond to particular cultures. The liberal multicultural focus on the state is a consequence, I think, of a preoccupation for justifying state management of those marked as othered through seemingly more palatable forms of governance than historically employed through overt colonial or racist forms of policing. In particular, liberal multiculturalists are concerned with the extent and limits of state tolerance and accommodation. Now, while they certainly adjust the goal of liberalism because of a desire to be sensitive to group differences, ultimately this new paradigm simply sets new parameters of justified state coercion, where the focus is now not only on the extent of individual liberties, but also the extent of group liberties. It's therefore not surprising that liberal multiculturalists evade the socio-political arrangements that structure the identities and lives of different indigenous women and women of colour, as these groups don't pose a direct or immediate threat to the unity of the state, at least from the liberal multicultural perspective. This reflects a concern, I think, for managing particular kinds of diversity, rather than a concern to attend to various kinds of power differences, including those power differences between members of society. So ultimately, this approach to the study of identity and difference, I think, is both narrow in scope and depth, and the effect of that is erasing the ways in which we can understand the identities of different kinds of racialized women. Now, to bring forward this kind of analysis and to put at the center of analysis the various ways in which the identities of racialized women are constructed, we can turn to various kinds of critical feminism that have intersectionalized questions of identity and difference. So theorists here that I'm drawing upon include such thinkers as Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, Gloria Anzaldúa, Merita Pearl Lafond, Uma Narayan, Patricia Moncha-Angus, Chandra Mahanti, Trin Mahar, Donna McIver, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, and Ange Marie Hancock, and the list can go on and on. There are in particular four major insights that this critical feminist scholarship brings forward to the study of identity and difference. The first of these is that this scholarship takes us beyond a unidimensional focus. So it takes us beyond an understanding of simply the idea of culture. Feminist critiques emphasize that unidimensional approaches tend to focus only on one aspect of identity. Hierarchical approaches may acknowledge more than one aspect of identity, but one of these tends to be prioritized. And additive approaches simply append one aspect of identity to another. So these different ways of giving one aspect of identity primacy are critiqued by these different kinds of feminists. Now, whilst there's some disagreement about how various aspects of identity actually interconnect within the feminist scholarship, there is a sense that systems of oppression and privilege operate through each other. Now, this is important to the study of identity and difference because an analysis of the interactive systems doesn't just simply complicate an understanding of identity and power. Rather, such analysis reveals the ways in which sometimes competing systems enable each other. So that's the first, that we need to go beyond a unidimensional understanding of identity. Secondly, these feminists have emphasized that it's not the entity of identity that we need to focus on. So it's not the entity of culture, for example, but rather it's the processes of identification that need to be examined. So while some feminists do continue to treat systems systems as entities like race, class, and gender, I want to emphasize that it's the processes of racialization, of sexism, of patriarchy that we need to be examining. Thirdly, these feminists have brought forward an understanding that we need to have differing degrees and modes of oppression and privilege understood in an analysis of identity and difference. So the focus here is not just between the state and civil society, but it's also an understanding of the multi-dimensional ways in which identities are made and marked by differing modes and degrees of dominance and subordination. As Maxine Zinn and Bonnie Dill have stated, people experience race, class, gender, sexuality differently depending on their social location in the structures of race, class, gender, and sexuality. This is important to the study of identity and difference because variations that are produced through diverse interactions do not only just shape the experiences of different kinds of identities differently, but the shape of those categories themselves are also varied because of power. Thus, not all women racialized as other experience the interactions of identity and racialization in the same way, and gender and racialization doesn't perform in the same way for all racialized women. Fourthly, these critical feminists have brought forward the insight that all identities are produced by various kinds of interactions. So it's moving beyond a focus on simply the othered subject. An interactive approach reveals that all identities are shaped by interrelated systems, including dominant identities. While these dominant identities are constructed through privileging systems, feminists often focus on those systems of oppression. Yet, and Patricia Hall Collins makes this argument, it's also important to note that relations of domination create very few pure victims or oppressors because, and this is a quote, each individual derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege from the multiple systems of oppression which frame everybody's life, end quote. Now the point of that is that identities do not simply represent either the power to govern or the state of being governed, but rather the context determines the degree and form of power at play. Now what I'm not suggesting here is that all identities are equally dominated, for this would be tantamount to arguing that power didn't matter. Rather, the aspect that I want to draw out through an intersectional or an interactive approach to the study of identity and difference